I've changed my title a little bit. I know probably a lot of you have seen the article that was in the Education Researcher, and I thought maybe I would have a title that would be a little sharper in posing the question I really want to discuss today. And of course, I didn't realize that in doing so, I had actually duplicated the title of Sam Meisel's, who's, when he gives his talk, you're going to see the same title. So we're going to be both asking the same question. And we'll figure out later whether we have similar answers or not. But I will say that for most of my adult life, I've been very skeptical about the proposition that schooling, improving schooling, could pretty much by itself dramatically reduce inequality in social class outcomes and in racial and ethnic outcomes. And I've changed, and my view has changed on that. And so I want to tell you today why I've become much more optimistic about this. And of course, and this was the reason I'm asking. I mean, what sort of motivated me to ask this question when I was asked to give the Brown lecture in honor of the anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education in Washington last October, and it really forced me to sit back and ask, look back over the history and think about what do we know, what can research help us say in answer to this question. Now, thinking about it though in a personal way, I must admit that I probably should have been more affirmative on this all the way along. And my role model for that is the father of my late wife, Stella. Lamar Pipkins, who grew up in Keithville, Louisiana, a small town about 16 miles south of Shreveport, Louisiana, born in 1924. And when he went to school, the schools for black children, of which he was one, were open 6 months of the year. The schools for white children were open 9 months of the year. Black children were expected to go out and pick cotton. The schools in Keithville, if you were black, ended at the 8th grade. That was it. There was no schooling past the 8th grade. If you were white, of course, you could go on to 12th grade. If the textbooks used by the kids in Keithville and throughout Louisiana were handed down from the white schools, sometimes with some very insulting scribbles written in the margin, white kids knew who was going to be getting those books. Despite the fact that it was impossible, if you lived in Keithville, to get a high school education, Lamar was able to get a high school degree because his parents sent him off to Shreveport, where he graduated from Central Colored High. So he was one of the few who was able to get a high school degree. And this was, of course, the beginning in a lifelong quest for education. And that's really my point, is if people are making such lifelong quests, there must be some reason to think it really matters. And that's a huge story, is the struggle that people have waged for educational equality. After graduating from Central Colored High, Lamar joined the Army Air Force during World War II and was in and helped desegregate that in 1947 and stayed in the service for 22 years, graduated, and he and his family settled in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, which is near Stewart Air Force Base, where he had been a soldier. And he immediately enrolled in Cape Cod Community College, and he was a wonderful student there, and was in fact recommended to go on, and he decided to go to Boston University. Took the bus every day, an hour and a half each way, with studying on the way up and the way back, and everywhere else, every other time he could do when he was working full time, basically, or as much as he could, selling baby furniture on weekends. And at the age of 58. He graduated with honors from Boston University. And he and his wife, Maggie, put their own kids through high school, sometimes private high schools. If the local public high schools were no good, they worked picking worms, and she had a worm farm, and working in factory, and he worked at the cafeteria. And their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids all had supplements of their tuitions and graduated from places like Temple University, Tuskegee University, Harvard, Princeton, a number of wonderful universities. So that happened in a single lifetime. And it happened because people were so committed to the idea that education would really make a difference. And if that could happen in the single lifetime of one person, one family, maybe the answer to this question could be yes, that education could be a way of getting equality. And so it's interesting to ask what was happening to millions of other people during those same years. So what we know, and a lot of this is based on my colleague Derek Neal's paper. He's written a wonderful paper on the convergence in test scores and educational achievement. But the title of it is, Why Has the Convergence Stopped? What we see between the time of Brown, roughly, and the late 90s, or the early 90s, is a dramatic reduction in the achievement gap. So for a young man born, a man born around the same time as Lamar, 1929, by 1960, we could expect that that person, if that person was white, would have about two and a half years more education than if that person was black. But for someone born in 1965, a man, by 1996, the gap was 0.8 years. That's about a threefold reduction in the gap. Tremendous reduction. 0.8 is too big of a gap, but just think about how dramatically it was reduced during those years. Same years that we're talking about in Lamar's lifetime. For women, the gap wasn't as big initially, but still very large, a 1.6, 1.7 year gap in 1960, reduced again by about almost a third to being 0.6 years by 1990. We see the same story. I did say graduation from high school, I hope. That's what I was talking about. These are years of education. No, these are just, I'm sorry, this is total obtained years of education. So this one is about the proportion of people who get a college degree. And a man born about the same year, 1930, by 1960, the white person would have about 4 times the likelihood of having a college degree. By 1960, the ratio was still big, way too big, about twice as big, but still that's half of what it had been. So a big reduction in gaps. For women, interestingly enough, the gap was a lot smaller and it pretty much has stayed invariant. So that's an interesting fact right there. There's a huge gender difference in the extent to which gaps existed and the extent to which they've been reduced. So that's the good news. And there's more good news. If we look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress and we look at achievement test scores, and we look at the black-white gap, going back to the late 60s, the gap was huge. Now, here, 0 would be no gap, okay? So a low number means there's a big gap. It's negative, okay? So in fact, the gap that existed back in the late 60s between blacks and whites in test scores, and this is in reading, were very large. So that a typical black child would score below 82% of all white children. Very, very big gap. Very steady and substantial reductions in that gap. You can see it's moving towards 0. It doesn't get there, but it's moving in that direction. Up until the late 80s or around 1990. But look what happens, and this is where we start to hit the bad news. The bad news is we see that this convergence has stopped, and even that there's some evidence of an increase in the gap since 1990. So that's a puzzle, and that's what Derek Neal's paper is about. For math scores, it's maybe, well, it's just about as dramatic. And the peak is a little bit earlier, but that's just because the tests are given in different years. And the fall off is gradual, but it's upsetting to know that this progress had stopped. And so there's a very interesting question. Why did it stop? Was it mainly something that was happening in schools? What was going on?